I want to start this video with what I think is a pretty intriguing question, and it has to do with the law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy. That systems always move toward increased entropy. They go from order to disorder. That's just what happens naturally. So why is it that we take this simple system right here? This is just a barren rock, a lava flow. But given 1 million years, how does that simple system become this incredibly complex tropical ecosystem with a massive amount of diversity and complex systems, with brains of mammals and an incredible amount of complexity? It doesn't seem like it's following the second law of thermodynamics. Well, remember, you can go against the law of thermodynamics if you add energy. So this is obviously going to take a bit of energy, but that's not the only thing. Why would just given energy, why would things go from simple to complex? That is an interesting quandary. There must be some advantage and benefit that a system derives from diversity. And that's what we're going to look at. And I'm going to look at some essential questions I'm going to put up here first. First one is, where does this diversity come from? Why is it so important? What is the role of natural selection? And then, how does artificial selection compare with natural selection? So, if you didn't get these terms, make sure you understand them. We've got our genes, alleles, genotype, mutations, and phenotype. Those are some terms we went over in class. And if you don't have those kind of put into your head, stop the video and put those in your notes. But diversity, there is a tremendous amount of diversity, and there's different kinds of diversity. So the first one would be ecosystem diversity, and that's just lots of different ecosystems in a certain area. So Ecuador is a great example. There's 6 major ecosystems all crammed into this small little area, incredibly complex. But then we have species diversity, and that's in one given ecosystem, how many different species are there. That's a lot of times what people think of when they diversity. Look at all, the diversity of a tropical rainforest. There's lots of different kinds of trees, lots of different kinds of animals, lots of different kinds of bugs, lots of different kinds of everything. Then we have genetic diversity, and specifically that has to do with the variety of genes within a given species. So within a species, there's genetic diversity, and these are all going to be very important. So where does that diversity come from? Because that's really the name of this unit, is the creation of diversity. Well, we've got evolution, and that is how species change over time. Then we have the term natural selection. And some people confuse these terms. They use them interchangeably, and they shouldn't be. Evolution is the big picture. That's what happens. Natural selection is kind of how it happens, the process that causes change. That's specifically natural selection. So we're going to take a look at natural selection. We're going to break it up into 4 important steps, which I want you to put into your memory. You're going to write them down in your notebook at the end of this. So the first part of natural selection starts with this term called biotic potential. Biotic potential, right? Potential means, potential. That's hard to describe. But as far as a species goes, it's the maximum number that a species can reproduce. So if you started with 1 pair of houseflies on February 1, right? Biotic potential would be how many different houseflies would you have after a certain time if every single offspring survived. And we know that's not going to happen, but it would go up exponentially, of course, right? But if you did the math, after, and you knew how long the generations were, you would have, as of June 1st, 191,000 times 10 to the 15th houseflies. That's impossible. That would fill up our whole galaxy probably of houseflies. So it's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen. Why isn't that going to happen? Why don't they all survive? More are born than are ever going to survive, right? So that first That's the first thing we need to know about natural selection. You're always going to have way more babies, way more offspring than are going to survive. But what is the next step is the most important step. What is the very root of natural selection? In other words, it's the foundation on which natural selection operates. It's the key to understanding. And without this, natural selection could not operate. It wouldn't be natural selection. There would be no selection. So what is that? Well, here's your clue. These are all different species, but there is variation within a species. There's always variation within a species. So if you had 1,000 or 1,000,000 houseflies, they wouldn't all be exactly the same, right? So that's the second step. More offspring that can survive, yet every one of those offspring is a little bit different. And that's because of things like mutations, and we're going to get to that too. The third thing then is there's some environmental pressure, right? The environment is going to select variations that are best suited. Not necessarily, you've heard that before, right? That's the, Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest. Well, it not necessarily is the fittest. It's just the ones that are going to reproduce, right? So that would involve sexiness too. So if you're fit, you're going to be better off. But if you're sexy, probably going to have more offspring as well. That's why I say we live in a very sexy world. Everybody's really sexy because the other ones just don't procreate as much. Or it could be the opposite. The environment's going to select against those that are least suited. There is actually a third one. Turns out, if you study genetics, if a gene is just close to a fitting gene, a good gene or a sexy gene, it's going to get selected more too. So you just got to be close to one of those. So that's the third thing. The environmental pressure is going to have this selection pressure. So if you're slow, you might get eaten, or if you're tasty, you might get eaten. You're not going to reproduce as much. So the last part is there are traits then that will be favorable for some reason, right? Those favorable traits are the ones that are going to be passed on to the next generation. So let's say this mutation created spines on this fly, so it just wasn't as tasty. It got spit out more often than not when it got eaten by a bird. That would be a trait that was randomly put on there, but it's going to be selected for through natural selection. So here's the steps of natural selection. And if you don't have them codified in your memory, write them in your notebook because you will be expected to know all these things in this order. So we've got 1, many more offspring are created than will survive. That's biotic potential. 2, in all those offspring, there's variation that exists, right? In all populations, there's variation that exists. And because that variation is there, environmental pressures are going to select those offspring with variations that are best adapted. And 4, those favored variations get passed on to the next generation. And so what will happen there is the population is going to adapt. Remember, an individual never adapts. An individual is either selected for or selected against. The population then adapts. So what you're going to do there's a handout that is in the module, and it's about 3 different kinds of evolution. The first one is natural selection, and I want you to come up with, you're just going to make up an example of natural selection, like I made up that one about the fly. It doesn't have to be real, it can be crazy or fun, but it's got to be an example of natural selection. And you're going to have to think of the organism, the trait. So trait would be something like length of hair or presence of spikes, right? The variation present would be spikes or no spikes, long hair or short hair. The environmental pressure would be, what's the selection pressure? In this case, it was predation by birds. Variation of the trait that's selected for or against. Spines were on the fly were selected for because they didn't get eaten. And so how does the species evolve? The species evolves to have spikes. So give me another example, have some fun with that one. So we're going to move on to a different kind of evolution, but it's very similar. So here we have all the different dogs. Now, dogs are all the same species, which means by the definition of species, you can reproduce and have fertile offspring. So any two dogs can reproduce and have fertile offspring. The hugest of dogs, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, somehow they can have fertile offspring, even though it seems unlikely. They've just all branched off from a common ancestor, and that was the wolf, right? So that's an old story. They think maybe it's happened 80,000 years of domestication. Now the wolf is still alive, so there are still wolves. So those are actually up on the tree as well. They coexist with all of its descendants, but that's not always the case. So what are dogs being selected for? Who's doing the selecting? Dogs are being selected for incredibly interesting traits. I know one kind of dog is being selected for the ability to be held, the temperament to be held, and brushed, the long hair to be brushed. You can selectively breed dogs like that. A lot of dogs have been bred for very useful things like retrieving or racing or whatever. But the difference here is that nature is not selecting it. Humans are selecting it. So here's another example of humans doing the selecting. Here's a native wild cabbage, and it has been selected by nature to exist the way it is in the environment that it lives in for millions of years. But then humans took care of this and basically have selectively bred the same species for many different things. And I think you might find this very interesting. If you select this wild cabbage just for big stems, like some are just randomly going to have bigger stems than others, and you keep on breeding those, you're going to get kohlrabi. That's a vegetable called kohlrabi that has big fat stem. If you select it for buds that are on the side instead of on the top, maybe just some individuals have buds on the side and you keep on selecting those, you're going to get Brussels sprouts. If you get selected for just one big terminal bud on the top, that's cabbage. If you select for flower clusters, you're going to get cauliflower. If you select them for stems and flowers, you're going to get broccoli. And if you select it just for big, humongous leaves, you're going to get kale. And they have since created some new versions of this just recently called Romanesca and broccolini. Those are all the same species. All of these are the same species, just like dogs. And they have been artificially selected because nature would never have done that. There's no purpose for this kind of selection except for we want it. So there's a couple examples of artificial selection. So again, just like you did with natural selection, I want you to come up with an example of artificial selection. Have some fun with it, just make it up. So my organism here was the cabbage. The trait might have been different size leaves. So the variations present in the trait, big leaves, small leaves. Desired adaptation, I want big leaves. Variation selected for or against, again, big leaves. And explain how the species evolved. It evolved to have big leaves. So you can come up with one much more fun than this one. It doesn't have to be realistic. It can be fanciful, but it should show that the selection pressure is human and not nature. So the third part of that handout is, hold off on that. We're going to do a little reading and watch another video before you do that third part.